Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for, should I say thank you or blame me for inserting this particular slot in the today national seminar on narration, narration and narratology. For me, it's an effort, a very demanding task of reducing 5 years effort to an output of some, let's say, 30-40 minutes. Because I am quite aware of, the shortage of time we are faced with, especially in view of those people who have come from far and wide for paper presentations. So the topic under consideration, as you have just been, introduced, was Black nationalism, its emergence and context. This is the title. Afterwards, actually, this was a title framed by one of my colleagues in a hurry, and just to be made a part of this seminar. In fact, I hadn't given any thought to the process of framing this title at that time. Let me depart for a moment from this title and move on to a new one, which is closer to the central title or theme of our seminar, that is Narration and Narratology. And my topic is Narration and Narratology, the African American context. This is the new title I am focusing on. And as all of you could learn from the morning's most vibrant academic discourse we had, that narration and narratology are tools for building up nations or nationhood. This is the focus of our presentation or our seminar discourse. Narration and narratology are tools for nation building. Nation building could be, as any of you can just imagine, just guess, of two types, naturally. One on good, proper foundation, and the other on maybe false or unjust foundations. And here I am going to bring to your attention a nation building process on just foundation, on justified grounds, and again on grounds and arguments which the world cannot ignore for long. Whereas we were in the morning concerned with the political deviation our country is faced with for a few years now, from its pivotal focus on the Nehruvian perception of India. And this movement, as I suppose there is a consensus, I don't know, I don't mind even if there is no consensus on the matter here, because I believe in academic accommodation of different views and opinions. So I give a space for everyone. So even if you stand on the side of these two, narration and narratology being exploited for building a nation or nationhood on wrong foundation, I still like to give an academic space for people with such perceptions or views. You might be familiar with the story of the building up of the United States as a nation, which is part of modern history. No one can say that I don't know. I am not familiar with what happened in the last, let's say, 300 years in the history of mankind. Of course, you know, it's today called the Taxpayers Country. Taxpayers Country. Earlier, it was the country known for having been founded by scoundrels. You remember that? They have another name, Pilgrim Fathers. But they were exiles from their native countries. All of you know that. They were excommunicated. They were people who were driven out from their respective homelands. Okay, you're familiar with that. You know the story, that part of the story. Anyway, today it is a country of taxpayers. Okay. Now there is another nation you might again find in history, which is a blemish to the history of civilization. That is, grabbing somebody else's land and making it yours, calling it by the name of a mythological weight which you have. That is in the very heartland of the Arab world, Israel. That is definitely an illegitimate country in the world. And now we are in India in the effort of building up a nation on once again, in my perspective, a wrong argument and a wrong mythology. That is, what do we call it? If you don't mind, let me, as its own perpetrators, term it Ramarajya. Okay, Sri Raman, I respect him so much, and I look upon him as one of the great heroes of this country. But does it give you the right to establish a country exclusively for his followers, simply because he was born in this country? In that respect, I think there are too many people born in this country who can make a similar claim. So this is what I say, it is a wrong argument based on which that they are building up a nation in our particular geographical space today. So 3 examples I have pointed out of, you see, the United States, which is the taxpayers' country, the Jewish country, Israel, and now the upcoming, whatever you call it, I don't want to call it by any name. I just like to call it India, because that's so touching, so inspiring, and so still enlightening for many of us. So we still like the word. So let it remain like that as long as it's possible for us to keep it in the same shape and in the same form. Okay, now I like to focus on my topic. That is black nationalism, or narration, and narratology, the African American context. And in fact, I did my PhD on this topic, on a related topic, and afterwards I published my dissertation after slightly updating and modifying the contents, and it's here for you. And its new title is Black America, the Islam Experience. If you like, if ever I cut short my presentation and make it more convenient for those of you who are making presentations here, there is no regret required at all. You can go to the book and you can borrow the book from our English Literary Forum library anytime you like, and go further for the elements which have been left out. Okay, now all of you are familiar with this particular community, black people. They come from, I don't have to introduce the black people to an audience like this, because all of you are familiar with Shakespeare's which play, The Tempest. The Tempest. It's a beautiful dramatization of, and incidentally, believe me, white people from Europe began to explore their opportunities in the newfound land, that is in the United States, almost simultaneously with the publication of Shakespeare's The Tempest. Right? Shakespeare's Tempest, I understand, was published in the first, in the second, beginning of the second decade of the 17th century. And the same period was when European people, especially white people, occupied the United States. Right? And these people came from Europe, as all of you know. They were white-skinned. They were maybe namesake Christians. I don't know whether they were very much committed to Christian values or not. Anyway, this was the story. And they found the United States to be a very amazingly fertile soil. And they found that England is a good market. Europe provides them with an excellent market for whatever you produce in the soil of the United States. So they needed labor, and cheap labor they were looking for, because their greed, you know, their excitement for making too lot of profit out of whatever effort they undertake. They made trips to the African coast and manhunted the African people caught them, made them slaves, and brought over to the United States. This was what happened. Where the people brought to the United States slaves, just take a look at the history of African, especially the Western African territories at the time when English people or white people from Europe traveled to Africa to catch them physically, like what you call a wild animal, or maybe just like a beast. Whatever way, you just watch some of the movies in this connection, you come to know how it happened. Anyway, they were not slaves at all. They were independent people practicing another culture, another religion, another set of values and so on. Simply because they were colored, they were dark-skinned, and there had been too many other advantages or elements which made it quite easy for white people to entice them to what is called the most atrocious thing in the history of mankind, that is enslaving humans, enslaving human individuals. This was what they did. And as early as 1611, they started bringing slaves from the African coast. And they were not actually slaves to begin with. They became slaves in the slave ships. You might be familiar with a play by, I think, Baraka, Imam Amir Baraka, I think, right? He has another name, Leroy Jones. Okay. Now, they were brought to the United States soil, and they were forcefully made slaves on the one hand. And also they were forced to accept Christian names. This was what happened. I do not blame Christianity for what happened at all, because Christianity does not promote slavery at any cost. Anyway, this happened. This was white people's or European people's greed that made them turn the black people brought from the United States into slaves and people carrying Christian names. This was the beginning. Now, for about, at the very beginning itself, the question was, the most important question in consideration at the time was their identity. What was a black man? What was an African in the American soil? In the white man's occupied land, it's not even his land. Remember Prospero, don't forget it. Prospero grabbed the island from Caliban, right? It was not even his land, his island. And how did he do it? Caliban remembers it. You gave me waters with berries in it. You gave me waters with berries in it. There were some short ways, shortcuts or easy ways of making the black people from the African soil easy work tools for them, or easy what you call labor for them, unpaid labor. And it took about 300 years almost. As you remember, in 1863, it's 1863 in the year in which Abraham Lincoln made a proclamation of the abolition of slavery, emancipation proclamation, abolition of slavery took place in that particular year. So how many years? Almost 1863, and backward 1611 or so. So almost 300 years, close to 300 years, I guess. Now, during this period, these people underwent all kinds of individuality laws. Right? They failed to know what they were. Until then, in the African soil, they were not called Negroes at all. But in the new soil, they have been, labeled as Negroes. Negro doesn't suggest anything good for them, at least in this particular context. It is in another angle not at all of any harm, because it comes from the name of a river, Niger. The word comes from Niger, so it's harmless. But in the given context, it was suggestive of, and of course you have terms like negritude, denigration, and too many such words. in this connection. Anyway, they stood for, all these words stood for or suggested the inherent, innate inferiority of the black people. This was what happened. So in about 300 years, black people had almost forgotten almost everything about their past, their kind of cultural status, their respectability, and too many such aspects which make a people proud of themselves. This was the situation. Now, their history was a big extent spoiled. Education was denied to them. Family life was denied to them. Then they had no kind of rights. And it's quite natural for, and besides, you have to bear in mind in this context that African people were, very cleverly made to believe that they are innately, inherently, intellectually inferior to the white race. And too many theories were propounded, or scientific proposals were made in the American Congress in the early 19th century, to the effect that African people do not, take their roots from the first man who was white. This is of a different origin. African people are of a different origin, not from the same roots, the first man at all. Right? They propounded theories of polygenesis, and they even went to the extent of saying that they were half humans. They represent a stage of human evolution. Right? They have not reached the phase of the complete evolution, the phase in which evolution has been complete and human race had emerged. So these people of Africa represent a stage between animals and humans proper. And naturally they were intellectually inferior. This was very cleverly, very systematically, and in a very concerted way taught to the people of the African background in the United States. This was even made part of education. And even after Emancipation Proclamation, black people were not treated as equals with white people. Right? In schools, colleges, restaurants, hotels, and such places, they were not treated as white people on equal terms with white people, and they were not welcomed in such places at all. And they suffered a lot to come to their own. You can imagine what will happen to a people if they were put to such conditions of life for a fairly long period. And the proximity to or exposure to good conditions or good ways of life will definitely be a good privilege for anyone. It will help anyone to go a big way in all walks of life, in fact. But black people were denied this. And it was in the last century, almost 100 years after the declaration of abolition of slavery by Abraham Lincoln, that black people make a very powerful rise, a very powerful coming back to the center stage in social life because of some movements which emerged from maybe the second decade to the seventh decade of the 20th century, the last century. So it took a long time. And actually, the first generation of freed slaves or ex-slaves were not capable of realizing their particular position, their particular status, or they were groping in the dark literally as to how to make a rise in life. Because for them, on the one side, they have the white people who were taking a very negative attitude to them. On the other, they don't have anything, because until then, they had the patronage of the slave masters. Now, slavery lifted, slavery abolished, there isn't even the patronage of the white slave masters to make sure that they get 2 times or 3 times meal a day. This was the basic requirement. School, you can forget schooling, you can forget skills training, you can forget everything of the kind. And these people were pushed into or pushed onto the streets of the United States cities. Right? Of course, the slavery was a very severe situation in America, in the south of the North America than in the north of the North America. So in the southern states of the North America, of course, this was a very serious and very severe situation. And after abolition, after the Emancipation Proclamation, these people, now they have lost their patrons, which, their masters, and they have lost their means of livelihood, and there isn't any sympathetic kind of deal or treatment from the side of the establishment, especially in view of the phenomenon you probably might be familiar with, that is the white supremacist movements, just like Ku Klux Klan and such movements were there, white terrorists, just like our Ripper, going with a hammer, right, smashing every head, just like that. Wherever a black man shows up, he was hammered down and he was silenced. This was the situation. So, you remember, probably you might have read Up From Slavery, the autobiography of Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington is sharing his experience, and he knows the kind of atrocities African people were subjected to in the United States those years. So he was, suggesting to the black people not to think of any white-collar jobs. Just get trained in any skill, any profession. Become a carpenter, become a mason, become something, some such, so that you will be in demand. You can make a living. This was the advice Booker T. Washington was giving. And in a few years' time, Malcolm X, probably you are familiar with him too. Malcolm X was asked by his teacher, "What do you want to be after schooling?" He was in class 8. And Malcolm said, "I want to become a lawyer." Lawyer? A nigger? A lawyer? This was the response of his white teacher. And you know what he did? He just abandoned his school. Right? The teacher told him to become a carpenter. Think of becoming a carpenter, you being a nigger. And this is a freed black, right? Not a slave. And almost 100 years after the proclamation of emancipation, and Malcolm X decided not to go ahead with that kind of a schooling, which tells him to become a carpenter. He was pretty well convinced that he had the guts, or maybe the brains, which will make him a powerful champion of his society, his community. And he became part of the Harlem hustlers. He became part of the slums of the major cities, and you find most of the African American, after the abolition of slavery, seeking an asylum in the slums of the major cities. And of all the parts of the world, only in the United States there is a most enterprising kind of literary genre known as Threesome Literature. There is a very beautiful book. I don't remember the author's name because I did this work almost 20 years ago. Now, and I couldn't get enough time to brush up my memory too. So that book brings to your attention a host of writers, emerging from American penitentiaries and prisons. How? Because potential blacks were pushed onto the streets. They had nowhere else to go. And what was the most sought after kind of jobs on the streets? Okay, you can just imagine marijuana carrier, right? Hashish carrier. Then pimps. Pimping is a very good job, because it fetches you money. Black man, leading black man to white women's sin dance and leading white men to black women's sin dens. This was the job. And even for Malcolm X, this was a short while job. A job for a short while. So these people were driven to criminality and ended up in prisons. And fortunately for your understanding, they became most amazingly, they got educated in a much unbelievable way in the prisons. Prison was their school. Penitentiaries were their proper school. Malcolm X recalls his experience in his autobiography to the effect that I have never been taught so realistically as I ever been taught in the penitentiaries. He was a young man and he was, you are familiar with the word penitentiary? Durguna Padashala or something like that. It's not just like a prison. Prison is for people of our age, grown-ups. And the penitentiaries are for underage criminals. And underage criminals were big hardcore criminals, because American streets could produce out of them only criminals, hopeless criminals. And he ended up in prison, and like him, too many others. And Malcolm X, while in prison, started reading history. And history, and luckily for Malcolm X, American penitentiaries had good libraries. That's a good thing. And we must appreciate the white man's establishment for that. And Malcolm X became a self-taught man, and after serving some 8 or 10 years in prison, close to that I think, or maybe a little more than that, he comes out as a very powerfully charged person. His education is grade 8 in school, right? And just outside the prison, he was a sought-after demagogue, a sought-after public orator. And universities were inviting him, offering him podiums like this to give a lecture on the predicament of black people. What transformed Malcolm X was his learning of history. He studied the annals of the black people. So he discovered a most amazing kind of discovery. What is that? That he was, number one, not from a slave ancestry. Number two, that he was not a Christian. Number three, that he was not an American. These three pieces of information made him undergo a complete change and take some very very strategically important kind of decisions. He abandoned his surname. Just think of it. He was previously, the boy who was put in prison was Malcolm Little. And now the boy who came out, he was not a boy now, a grown-up, right? And he was Malcolm X. Why X? My ancestry is mysterious, unknown. I do not want to be known after my slave master. Little is my slave master's surname. I do not want to be attached to that name. And my identity is not Little. Call me X to suggest mystery, mysterious. And there were a host of X people in the United States in that generation. Marvin X, Garland X, and too many X people you find following Malcolm X in this spirit. And Malcolm came out with a very profound realization about his situation, right? And initially he was very much charged with what is called a spirit of divisiveness, a spirit for separation, a spirit for what we call segregation, complete separation or segregation from white people. Life had convinced him that white people are devils. And he began to call them white devils. This was how because that was his experience. I will not blame him. That was his experience. And a few years outside the prison, he came to realize that this does not work. Something is wrong. Something is wrong with what I've been teaching my people. He had become a big hero at that time, right? Their t-shirts and too many, cultural life related icons or symbols were there already in the market, carrying the name of Malcolm X. Poems were written and slogans were raised and too many such representing this. Anyway, this was the time when Malcolm X was attracted to a movement which arose in the United States as part of what is called Black nationalism. So now a few minutes on Black nationalism. Black nationalism was to begin with a church phenomenon, right? There was an entirely different separate church set up for black people, black churches. Soon they came to know that church business will not take them anywhere. Churches will not be a force of liberation for an agency which will liberate them. Okay, and they started experimenting with the secular platforms. There were too many of secular platforms spearheaded by the black people of different backgrounds. A few to mention were the Martin Luther King's Civil Rights Movement, Niagara Movement, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, Advancement of the National Urban League, Congress of Racial Equality, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Civil Rights Movement, and magazines like The Crisis and so many such were in the. These were all with secular, secular faith or secular character. Then emerged in a very strange and mysterious way a movement known as the Lost Found Nation of Islam in the wilderness of the United States or something like that. Right? Nothing to do with the mainstream Islamic community elsewhere, outside. Right? Because it was not the digital age, it was not the age of mobile phones or WhatsApp or anything. People had no way to communicate with community people belonging to the Muslim community outside at all. They were completely separated from or truncated from what you call the mainstream Islamic community in the world. And in the mid-60s and 70s of the last century emerged this movement, the Lost Found Nation of Islam in the wilderness of the United States. And this was spearheaded by a man known today as Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad was Elijah Poole. Elijah Poole was his name. He was not a Muslim to begin with. He was a worker in, an industrial establishment, and somehow he got in touch with someone outside and came to learn about his roots. He discovered that he was from Africa, from the western states of Africa. His ancestral religion was Islam, and he must go back to it. This gentleman had known almost nothing about Islam, but he just knew the name and started doing things. And Malcolm X was attracted to this movement, and in fact Malcolm X was the most powerful public figure representing this movement at the time. But this was actually a hate movement, a hate movement. It promoted hating white people because it kept asking the black people to consider white as devils. But it doesn't work for a long time. Initially it will work because there is the brand, there is the kind of sense of revenge, there is the kind of natural spirit to react in a very violent and maybe unpleasant way to your slave masters who kept you stifled or trampled under their feet for 300 years. It's natural. And it was the initial stage. Soon, Malcolm parted ways with Elijah Muhammad, and he started a new organization of Afro-American Unity or something like that. And he traveled outside, traveled to Egypt, traveled to Saudi Arabia, to Mecca, performed the Hajj, changed, took a new name again, abandoned even the X phenomenon, and he, after performing Hajj, accepted a new name, that is Al-Hajj Malik Shahbaz, and came back to the United States. And in a few months' time, in 1964, he was shot dead. This is the story of Malcolm X. But Malcolm X represents a very powerful voice of the African American community, in the sense that he was the one who taught the African American people that hate is not the way, racism is not the way, segregation is not the way. Accept an ideology which gives you respectability, and if it is your own ancestral roots in the same faith, it's twice a blessing for you. This was Malcolm's realization. Malcolm started making tours all over the European countries. He traveled to UK. He traveled to many places, offering lectures in universities and so on. His education was class 8 at school, right? This was 8. Anyway, this is the phase of return to the roots, returning to the roots, Africanness, on one ground, Islam, then they are abandoning the new identities and so on. There were too many figures in this context, and establishments like Moorish Science Temple, the Garveyite African nationalism, then the figure known as Noble Drew Ali and so on, the Lost Found Nation of Islam, then figures like W.D. Farth, then, okay, now I'm winding up. The doctrines put forward by the movement that Malcolm X represented at this stage was black people are number one, black people are not Negroes. Number one, we are not Negroes. This is the name you have given us. Number two is, we are the lost found nation of Islam. We belong to the nation of Islam, and we were lost, and we have rediscovered our roots. Now another one, and this is actually a very fictitious kind of thing. They believed that Allah has come to the United States to rescue them, right? And what was Allah for them? Just a man, right? Someone from Egypt who was going about with maybe giving lectures and so on. They ascribed this name to that person and started believing it. Then they were making myth, to the effect that the original man was a black man, not a white man. And what about the white people? That is the creation of a scientist by name Yaqub. Yaqub was a scientist among the black people who was mischievous in nature, and who, as part of his villainies, by I don't know what method he accepted. Anyway, he created a new race with devilish nature, and that new race come to existence that way was the white people. Okay, this was a myth they created. And the myth of the magnolias and the doctrine of the superiority of black men. Magnolias is the name of a tree. And African American people who were in the United States in conditions of slavery, whenever they were free, they used to spend their time under such huge trees. Magnolia is a huge tree. Doing what? Just whiling away their time, suggesting that they are intellectually quite inferior, not capable of big mental tasks, and so on, to suggest that they were, people who were lazy in nature. This is it. And now they wanted to establish a new perception about themselves. It was that we are superior. Black people are superior. So this was how they tried to build up their psyche, or to make it strengthened. Now they believed that there is an Armageddon to come. That is a huge battle to take place between the forces of virtues and the forces of evil. There will be a fight, and the forces of evil are represented by the white man, and the force of virtue was represented by the black man. And in this huge battle, the white man will be completely wiped out. This was a myth they created and made the black laity to believe. Now, there are too many such details to explore. I am leaving out most of them. And you get the annals of the black people represented in a very attractive way in Alex Haley's Roots, right? Television serial based on this is, I think, still available on the YouTube. Now, Malcolm X's autobiography is another important book which will help you a great deal to learn about the history of the black people's self-realization. Now, with these, of course, now the two other terms, narration and narratology, how did these help building up the black nation is the question. Definitely, the black writers, black artists, and black thinkers played a very important role in rebuilding the black psyche. Not for any destructive purpose, not for any segregatory purpose, no. For black people to be proud of their roots, to be on their own, to be on their feet. Okay, so this is the question. Now, narration or literature, arts, music, and all these were exploited in a very tremendous way for building up the shattered black psyche. African man's psyche was to be rebuilt, and it was done with the help of literary works. And they had developed a very interesting or amazing kind of narratology for the purpose. That too is very important. Okay, an aesthetic of their own, black aesthetic, which was put forward by Amiri Baraka and others of the school. Then there was Askia Muhammad Chow or Roland Snellings, and there were too many others. And you are familiar with the second black renaissance of the 1960s. In the 1920s, there was the first Harlem Renaissance or the first black renaissance. And in the 1960s and 70s, there was the second black renaissance, the key figure of which was Imam Amiri Baraka or Leroy Jones. Okay, Leroy Jones even brought into effect a theatre which was known as BARTS, Black Arts Repertoire Theatre. Black Arts Repertoire Theatre School. That's the name. BARTS. He called it BARTS. And he had, together with others, developed a black aesthetic of, a very significant kind of black aesthetic itself. And let me wind up by reading out a few lines from the writings of some of the eminent poets who contributed to the building up of the black psyche. And here one poem by Leroy Jones. Just pay attention to a few more lines, and I say thank you to you. Now, we are unfair, and unfair we are black magicians. Don't forget this line. We are unfair. Unfair means not fair. Skin not fair. We are unfair, and unfair we are black magicians. Black arts we make in black labs of the heart. The fair are fair and deathly white. The day will not save them, and we on the night. Very interesting. A very powerful way of building up black psyche. Take it this way. We are unfair means our skin is not fair. Unfair, we are black magicians. Since we are black, we are magicians. We are black magicians. We make miracles or magic. Black arts we make in black labs of the heart. Our hearts are black, and they are not just hearts, they are the labs of black arts. Then the fair are fair. White people are fair. The fair are fair and deathly white. Fair suggests that something is absent. White means something is absent, no color, that's it. Now, and the day will not save them. Why? They are white, and the day will not make their presence of any significance. And we on the night. Night is ours. They do not benefit from day, and can they claim night? No, night is ours, our color. This is what he wrote. And a few more lines. Yeah, we want a black poem by the same poet. No, this by Baraka himself. We want a black poem. We want a black poem and a black word, a black world. Let the world be a black poem. Let all black people speak this poem silently or loud. This is what he wrote. So now, okay, I think that's enough. Just in one or two sentences, let me wind up. Black nationalism, or maybe these three titles, Narration Narratology in the African American context, I could find that a nationalism or a movement coming up there which reclaimed for its followers dignity, respectability, a sense of pride, and also it showed them a new way of literary creativity, a new aesthetics, a new style of writing, and you find a host of poets, writers, memoir writers, biography writers, fiction writers, and artists, playwrights, and theatrical, people of the theater workers, all these coming up, and a big literary movement and cultural movement emerging as a result of this new spirit of black nationalism. Now, black nationalism has undergone changes after the time of Malcolm X. Malcolm X showed them the right path just before his death, his assassination. He realized that segregation is not the way, right? Apartheid is not to be encouraged, even if it's from the side of black people. It cannot be accepted. Apartheid is not a solution. Accept every human individual as your brother, as part of your community, and develop a new worldview which will liberate you. This was what he realized, and we find the black nationalist movement, especially the black Muslims movement, splitting into two. Those who realized that the religion or the belief and ideology taught by Elijah Muhammad was not the right Islam, and a big chunk of its followers started following the mainstream Islam practiced everywhere, and some of them remained with Louis Farrakhan with the same nationalist spirit, and there is a huge space for the secular black people. Okay, so black community in the United States now could be found to be made up of three clear segments. Number one, the biggest majority might be the secular black people, then the black nationalists, and those who have been fully integrated in the international Islamic community. This is what I could find. Anyway, with these words, let me wind up my talk, and thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.